Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Brodigan, Alumni Relations Officer at Trinity Development and Alumni, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Inspiring Ideas at Trinity webinar on the complexity of truth-telling in a post-truth age with guest speakers Dr. Fáinche Ryan and Dr. Alexander O'Hara. The talk today will last about 30 minutes and we'll leave plenty of time for audience questions. We do really encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to pop them in as you think of them throughout the webinar. Please note we're also using Zoom AI-generated closed captions for the webinar, and if you'd like to turn those on or off, you can do so by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen and clicking Hide or Show Subtitles. The talk today is also being recorded and will be available for later viewing on our YouTube channel. So now I'd just like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Fáinche Ryan is a lecturer in systematic theology and was director of the Loyola Institute from 2016 to 2020. She was elected Fellow of Trinity College Dublin in 2019. Her doctorate work on the theology of Thomas Aquinas was completed at the Angelicum in Rome in 2007. Fáinche was president of the Irish Theological Association 2010 to 2016 and is presently the president of the Irish section of the European Society for Catholic Theology. Her current research focuses on the virtue of truth-telling in a post-truth era. Dr. Ryan also works in the area of ecclesiology and ministry. Since coming to Trinity College Dublin, her research interests have expanded to include the theology of the early Irish Church. Dr. Alexander O'Hara is a research fellow in the Loyola Institute. Dr. O'Hara is the expert in early medieval Ireland and Europe, a graduate of the University of St. Andrews and Oxford University. His current research project, Savage Saint Island, Imagining Ireland and the Irish from Classical Antiquity to Anglo-Norman Conquest, explores the development of Irish ethnic identity and the changing cultural perception of Ireland and the Irish. He's also author of Jonas of Bobbio and The Legacy of Columbanus, and editor of Columbanus and the Peoples of Post-Roman Europe, both published by Oxford University Press in 2018. So now I'd just like to hand over to Fáinche, who'll start her presentation, and that will be followed by a discussion with Alexander. So over to you, Fáinche.
So thank you very much, Amy, and good afternoon to everyone. It is both a delight and indeed a privilege to address Trinity alumni on what is for me a fascinating area of subject to study, the complexity of truth-telling. I have been involved in this project on truth-telling, truthfulness, for a number of years now, and I must say that my interest in the topic continues to grow. I'm going to share my screen with you now, so if you just bear with me for a moment, please. Okay, so the complexity of truth-telling in a post-truth age. The first image that you can see there is probably familiar to many of you. It's from Rome, the Bocca della Verità, the mouth of truth. Apparently, this great face with the open mouth that you can see there was originally a drain cover in classical time, and then sometimes in the Middle Ages, it was inserted into the portico of a church, the Church of Santa Maria in Cosmedin. The legend is that if you put your hand in the mouth, if you were someone who did not tell the truth, the mouth would close and your hand would be bitten off. You can see the image there on one side, that's Audrey Hepburn in the film Roman Holiday, which is a very famous scene at the Bocca della Verità. It's an old film from 1953. So evidently, concern with truth-telling is not new. The theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas stressed the importance of truth-telling for the good of society. Indeed, it was with Aquinas that I started my study, my research. He identified truth-telling as a satellite virtue of justice. We owe it to one another that we be truth-telling people. But is he correct? Does truth-telling really matter all that much? Many recent happenings in our world, in the Western world at any rate, would suggest not. A few years ago, in 2016, Oxford Dictionaries announced that post-truth was their international word of the year. Post-truth they defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Objective facts less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Documented usage of the term post-truth increased by 2,000% from 2015 to 2016. The frequency spiked in June with the Brexit vote, and then in July when Donald Trump secured the Republican presidential nomination. The prefix post is of interest here. Unlike its use in post-war, which refers to the time after the war, or post-match, which refers to maybe a celebration or commiseration after a match, the prefix in post-truth has a meaning more like belonging to a time in which the specified concept, truth, has become unimportant, irrelevant. In 2016, I read that the University of Sydney had established a post-truth research excellence initiative. The aim of this initiative to advise on how the truth might survive in this climate. Chilling words. So let us return for a moment to Thomas Aquinas. Truth-telling is a matter of justice. We owe it to one another that we be truth-telling. We can trust one another only if we can assume that for the most part, people are being truthful. If we cannot trust one another, society will be destroyed. Hence, it is my belief that while we are rightly concerned with ecological issues, with global warming, my argument is that we should be equally concerned about a culture wherein it seems that truth and truth-telling do not seem to matter all that much. We are in danger of destroying our very humanity. So there are many tracks that one could follow in this discussion. Today, I thought we'd focus on two. Firstly, on truth-telling and politics, then truth-telling and the academy, and then, time permitting, we'll finish with a little look at some complex situations of truth-telling. So to begin with truth-telling and politics, I want now to introduce some aspects of the work of Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt was born in Germany in 1906. Her parents were well-educated secular Jews who ensured that she received a Jewish education in the synagogue. Hannah lived in Germany through the First World War, and before the Second World War, she left Germany and finally settled in the United States, where she followed a life of teaching at a university and of political writing. Initially, she was delighted in the US, delighted with what she perceived as a culture of plurality and diversity. With time, she became increasingly critical in her writings. In various writings, she commends people who do not think it worthwhile to change their humane attitude and their natural insight into reality for the narrowness of caste spirit or the essential unreality of financial transactions. These people who do not think it worthwhile to change their humane attitude and their natural insight into reality, she terms them social pariahs, perpetual outsiders, who insist upon telling the truth, even, she says, to the point of indecency. They insist upon telling the truth, rendering themselves unpopular, but keeping their identity. It is these social pariahs, she believes, who should take their place in the polis. In her classic, The Origins of Totalitarianism, published in the 1950s, she argues that totalitarian ideologies aim not at the transformation of the outside world or the revolutionizing transmutation of society, but the transformation of human nature itself. The concentration camps are the laboratories where changes in human nature are tested, she wrote. Totalitarian regimes represent an organized attempt to destroy the human being as human being, to eradicate the concept of human being. And I wonder, could something of the same be said of a culture that speaks of a post-truth era? In 1967, Arendt wrote an essay entitled Truth and Politics. Now, the context is important because some years earlier, in 1963, she had published her report, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. She was shocked at the hostility and by the controversy surrounding its publication. You can see a picture there of Eichmann on trial in Jerusalem for the crimes he was judged to have committed during the Second World War. He was a Nazi. Outrage erupted after Hannah published her work, in particular due to her judgment that her own people had acted unworthily at times. In particular, that the Jewish councils, through which the Nazis ruled some Jewish communities, had, she believed, played a role in the destruction of their own people. She felt pressurized by the controversy to change her account, to suppress disrupting truths. And this leads her to ask, is it of the very essence of truth to be impotent, and of the very essence of power to be deceitful? Is it always legitimate to tell the truth? Fiat veritas et periat mundus. Should the truth be told? Should the truth be done, even if the world is to perish? Powerful, challenging questions. Her argument is that to sacrifice truth for the sake of the survival of the world is futile. For in sacrificing truth, the very survival of the world is at stake. Her argument is that there must always be in the world people who will consciously say what is. For to say what is, for Hannah, is to say the truth. No permanence, no perseverance in existence can even be conceived of, she believes, without people willing to testify to what is and appears to them because it is. Truth matters. Truth is not indifferent. Arendt felt pressurized to deny truth, to a negation of factual truth. She thus comes to see the vulnerability, the fragility, as she puts it, of factual truth. Facts can be forgotten, they can be denied, they can be lied away, and perhaps, she says, never rediscovered. Facts have what she calls a disturbing contingency. Things they might have been otherwise. Facts have no conclusive reason whatever for being what they are. Things can always have been otherwise. For Hannah, if political action is understood in terms of the end justifying the means, and if the ends, the goals, are of pleasure, profit, or domination, then all facts, all truths can be in political jeopardy. This, she says, has led some to argue that truth can be sacrificed and that lies are relatively harmless tools in the arsenal of political action. I think we don't have to point out the contemporary relevance of much of what she's written. So facts, opinion, truth. While Arendt agrees that people have a constitutional right to their opinion, she is wary in regard to how opinions are formed. She has seen how even factual truth, When exposed to the marketplace, the public sphere, it can become blurred. They become blurred, factual truth. Factual truth normally pertains to events and circumstances in which many are involved. It is established both through testimony by eyewitness, and eyewitnesses, she says, are notoriously unreliable, as well as by records, documents, and monuments, all of which, she says, can be suspected as forged. To settle matters via a majority of witnesses is for Arendt a wholly unsatisfactory procedure, since there is nothing to prevent a majority of witnesses from being false witnesses. And indeed, under certain circumstances, the feeling of belonging to a majority may even encourage false testimony. Under certain circumstances, the feeling of belonging to a majority may even encourage false testimony. Factual truth, when exposed to the hostility of opinion holders, becomes vulnerable. Factual truth, she sees, is all too easily countered, not by lies and deliberate falsehoods, but by opinion. In matters of opinion, our thinking is truly discursive, but our opinions must be informed by fact. Subversive groups, she notes, in a politically immature public can argue people into confusion. The blurring of the dividing line between factual truth and opinion belongs among the many forms that line can assume. And yet, the fourth US president, James Madison, noted that all governments rest on opinion. No one can rise to power, no one can keep power without the support of those who are like-minded. And so it is opinion and not truth that seems to be an indispensable prerequisite of all power. In this view, politics becomes a question of numbers. Arendt sees that this shift from truth to opinion can easily be a shift to a domain in which nothing counts except strength of numbers, what she terms the ever-changing opinion of the citizen. And in this way of seeing society, the demagogue can persuade the multitude. To suggest that factual truth is vulnerable is, for most of us, shocking. Arendt writes, freedom of opinion is a farce unless factual information is guaranteed and the facts themselves are not in dispute. If we lose factual truth to opinion, we lose politics properly understood. So to an example she often cites, it is a fact that on August the 4th, 1914, German troops crossed the frontier of Belgium. But Hannah warns that even this fact could be eliminated from history by a power monopoly of the entire civilized world, and that this is far from inconceivable. If power interests have the last say, factual truth can be different. She wrote this in the 1960s, but I believe it's an important point for reflection today. She writes, which brings us back to our suspicion that it may be in the nature of the political realm to be at war with truth in all its forms. And any claim in the sphere of human affairs to truth, to an absolute truth, whose validity needs no support from the side of opinion, strikes at the very roots of all politics and all governments. She then comes to wonder why the question of why a commitment even to factual truth is felt to be an anti-political attitude. Her answer, truth carries within it an element of coercion. Truth carries within it an element of coercion. Truth, she says, is relentless. Truth tellers can be seen as tyrannical. Truth does not admit debate, and it is debate that constitutes the very essence of political life. Truth is opposed to opinion. Germany invaded Belgium. The earth moves around the sun. Pythagoras' theorem that in a right-angled triangle, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the squares on the opposite two sides. All these truths, arrived at in very different ways, have in common that they are beyond argument, dispute, opinion, or consent. Truth is tyrannical. It doesn't matter how many accept. It doesn't matter whether I agree or not. The earth still moves around the sun. The content of truth, she notes, is not of a persuasive nature, but of a coercive one. And this leads Hannah to speculate that, seen from the viewpoint of politics, truth has a despotic character. Truth is as independent of the wishes and desires of the citizens as is the will of the worst tyrant. Truth is as independent of the wishes and desires of the citizens as is the will of the worst tyrant. Tyrants hate truth. And even in the best of political regimes, truth enjoys a rather precarious status in the eyes of governments that rest on consent and abhor coercion. And so the modern condition, mass manipulation of fact, organized lying. In the 1960s, Arendt noted that mass manipulation of fact and opinion had become evident in the rewriting of history, in image making, and in actual government policy. Modern political lies deal efficiently with things that are not secret at all, but are known to practically everybody. Modern political lies rewrite contemporary history under the eyes of those who witnessed it. She notes then that the advent of mass media ensured, even in her time, that there is much more, that these rewritten histories, these political lies, are much more in the public eye than the original fact ever was. This form of organized lying is violent. It is destructive. It destroys whatever it has decided to negate. And she gives the example of Trotsky, whose place in Russian history was written out of the history books and who was finally executed. Modern lies, she says, are different from the much less damaging traditional lies, which simply hide the truth. She gives an interesting perspective. She says the traditional lie causes a hole in the fabric of reality. But as long as the fabric holds, the lie will eventually show up. That's the traditional lie. And with the traditional lie, those lying, the diplomats and the statesmen, knew they were lying. They remained aware of the distinction between truth and falsehood. Modern political lies, she says, are different, for they seek to completely rearrange history, to manipulate facts, to make another reality. Self-deception is inherent to the modern lie. Successful liars fall prey to their own lies and become part of a web of deceptions. Destructive lies pull the ground from under our feet and provide no other ground on which to stand. As Montaigne wrote, if falsehood like truth had but one face, we should know better where we are, for we should then take for certain the opposite of what the liar tells us. But the reverse of truth has 1,000 shapes and a boundless field. In the face of all these observations, Arendt notes that truth yet has a strength of its own. For while persuasion and violence can destroy truth, whether it be rational truth, religious truth, or factual truth, they cannot replace it. Facts, while fragile, are, she believes, resiliently stubborn. When a community has embarked upon organised lying on principle, truthfulness then becomes a political factor of the first order. When everybody lies about everything of importance, the role of the truth teller becomes essential. They must engage in political business. They must make a start towards changing the world. But if politics rests on opinion, we must ask, how can a truth teller survive and remain truthful in the political sphere? This indeed is a challenge. And this is where what Hannah Arendt terms refuges of truth come into their own. Despite the strong critique above, Hannah Arendt remains a believer in politics, while being very wary of the type of politics she was experiencing. The challenge she sought is to ensure truthful facts that inform opinion, to challenge the view that all opinions are equally valid, and to enable informed debate. Social spaces and social practices where this can be fostered and where people can be formed into truth-telling are needed. Example is identified for her as important. Socrates staked his life on his belief that it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. This, he said, is truth, and he was executed for living a life dedicated to truthfulness. Arendt notes that Socrates taught integrity by example, and she names others who taught by example or persuaded by inspiration. Jesus of Nazareth and Francis of Assisi are named. Hannah writes of the importance of the imitatio Christi, an idea core to Christianity. Immanuel Kant's idea of examples of virtue or holiness from history and from poetry, what Hannah terms exemplary truth, is also proposed as an aid to formation into being a truth-telling person, to being a truth-bearer. She also draws attention to certain public institutions, established, she says, and supported by the powers that be, in which, contrary to all political rules, truth and truthfulness have always constituted the highest criterion of speech and endeavour. And these institutes she terms refuges of truth. You can see in the PowerPoint there, two examples of these. She counts the judiciary, as well as all institutions of higher learning to which the state entrusts the education of its future citizens. While yes, she knows that these institutions are exposed to all the dangers arising from social and political power, the chances for truth to prevail in public are, of course, greatly improved by the mere existence of such places and by the organisation of independent, supposedly disinterested scholars associated with them. The chances for truth to prevail in public are greatly improved by the mere existence of these places. That, at least in many countries of the world, the political realm has recognised that it has a stake in the existence of people and institutions over which it has no power, she remarks, is noteworthy. Unwelcome truths come from these refuges of truth. Most recently in Ireland, on May the 10th, 2021, just last week, we read that 10 people shot dead in Ballymurphy, West Belfast in 1971 were all entirely innocent of any wrongdoing on the day in question. Delivering her findings in Belfast, Mrs. Justice Siobhan Keegan found that 9 out of 10 were shot by the British Army, and that in the majority of cases, the force used was disproportionate. This is an example, a recent example, of the judiciary telling truth. Very unwelcome truths have also emerged from universities. For intellectual integrity is the mission of the university. Here again, Arendt gives us pause for thought. Even in the 1960s, she was concerned. In the US, she commented that the authentic political significance of the academy is too easily overlooked, and I quote, because of the prominence of its professional schools and the evolution of its natural science divisions, end of quote. While no one can gainsay the social and technical usefulness of the role that all these play, the professional schools and the natural sciences, as we have seen recently with Trinity's scientific contribution to the current pandemic, Arendt argues that the historical sciences and the humanities, which are supposed to find out, to stand guard over, to interpret factual truth and human documents, are politically of greater relevance. There's much to think about there. While the press, the media are indispensable as they tell us what is happening in the world, like the judiciary, they too must be protected from political power, as must the university. But she says the press, the media alone is insufficient. It is the academy that must form people who will courageously guard and intelligently interpret factual truth and human documents. So thus, Hannah has given us a lot to think about. So fiat veritas et periat mundus. Is it always right to tell the truth, the facts, no matter what? To say what is? But to say what is always part of a story. And so we will finish with a further, shorter consideration of the complexity of truth-telling. You have there a picture of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor, who was executed for his role in a plot to kill Hitler. He also considered questions of truth-telling in his writings. The political situation in which he was living made clear to him the complexity of truth-telling. In Berlin, in Nazi Germany, Bonhoeffer came to understand that to betray a friend to a murderer is a grotesque misunderstanding of why one should tell the truth. Truth, he believed, is to be told not out of loyalty to abstract principles or to keep our consciences pure. Rather, truth is to be responsible to God for him and to our neighbor. Truth is to be responsible. In an unfinished essay entitled What is Meant by Telling the Truth, written while in prison shortly before his execution, Bonhoeffer ponders not a theory of truth, but like Hannah Arendt, wonders what it means to be truthful, to live truthfully. Interrogated regularly, Bonhoeffer was challenged to think deeply on his belief that yes, truth matters, and at once to conceal the true facts with regard to the planned assassination of Hitler. This, he deemed, was essential in order to protect both the plan and the conspirators, the people involved. I want to focus solely on one context that Bonhoeffer discusses in his considerations of what is meant by telling the truth. He thinks of the relationship between an adult and a child, particularly a parent and a child. He notes that the truthfulness of a child towards his parents is essentially different from that of parents towards their child. The truthfulness of a child towards their parents is essentially different from the truthfulness of a parent towards their child. Telling the truth must be learned. It calls upon one to read the situation one is in. The more complex the situation, the more difficult it is to know what to tell the truth means. The example that Bonhoeffer provides is very interesting. He says, a child is asked publicly in a classroom if his father comes home drunk at night. Well, yes, this is the case. The child denies this to the teacher. The child denies the fact to the teacher. Bonhoeffer rules that in this situation, it is the teacher that is wrong. For this question should not have been asked in this way of a child who has not yet worked out how to answer the question in such a way as to protect the family and at once satisfy the rule of the school in regard to truth-telling. Indeed, the child has told a literal lie, but this lie contains truth, as the child's action serves to preserve the institution of his family and to protect his father's weakness. While formally untrue, Bonhoeffer urges us to resist judging the child's action as telling a lie. Another challenging example he poses to us is that of the child who reports her parents to the state police for having uttered a dismissive word about Adolf Hitler. If the parents are then taken to a concentration camp, how are we to assess the child's action? The child merely stated verbatim the parents' words. But on Bonhoeffer's view, a despicable lie has been told. For he believes that in a perverted order of the real, the mandate of governance had been twisted by the Nazis and turned into something demonic. And the child had been involved in an act of betrayal involving a lie. Truth-telling, to really tell the truth, calls upon us to act intelligently, to think about occasion, to think about relation, about who or what entitles me to speak. Appropriate truth-telling is a virtue of the mature. And so to some final thoughts. It is clear that to say what is, to speak the truth, is to express the real. To speak the truth is to know the facts. And facts inhabit a story. Facts inform opinions. Facts demand interpretation. Words are embedded in story, in relationship. When words become homeless, they lose their truth-bearing capacity. For truth-telling, which is rooted in facts, is much more complex. One must consider those to be betrayed in Bonhoeffer's account. The family of the father who drinks too much, the parents of the child who goes to the Nazis. And then we come to the person who has cancer or some other serious illness. How much truth can they take? Do they want to know the science? And what about the sick child? What to tell them? Is complete transparency always the best approach, the correct course of action? A simple example that comes to my mind is that of feedback to a student. To be truthful but helpful at once. And in a new relationship, is it always best to expose all my past relationships? Is it necessary? As a child grows into adulthood, Do they always have to tell their parents where they are, what they are doing? The list goes on. But I'd like to leave the final word to Hannah Arendt. Conceptually, we may call truth what we cannot change. Metaphorically, it is the ground on which we stand and the sky that stretches above us. Truth is that which we cannot change. It is the ground on which we stand and the sky that stretches above us. So now I would like to introduce you to my colleague, Dr. Alexander O'Hara. So, hi, Alex.
Hi, Fáinche, and thank you very much for a very stimulating and thought-provoking presentation. You mentioned the great Dominican theologian from the mid-13th century, Thomas Aquinas, at the beginning of your talk. Aquinas was, of course, one of the leading lights in the University of Paris in its heyday, when the universities had developed from cathedral schools in the 12th century. The final quote from Hannah Arendt, truth metaphorically is the ground in which we stand and the sky that stretches above us. That beautiful quote reminds me of Aquinas' concept of God as existence or being itself, which accords to the name that God self gives itself in the book of Exodus: I am who is, I am. So to what extent then do you think that a culture that is so-called post-truth or totalitarian regimes, such as the former Soviet Union, where truth and facts are suppressed or changed, is a denial or revolt against reality and existence itself? So I'm thinking of the recent drama series Chernobyl, about the suppression of the truth of actually what happened in Chernobyl. And that this is kind of one of the early warning signs of totalitarian regimes, is a denial of truth. I'm also thinking of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's text, Live Not by Lies, and his refusal to lie that informed his literary work. And Solzhenitsyn equates lies with ideology, as does Arendt, the illusion that human nature and society can be reshaped to predetermined specifications. I'll just quote from him: "For violence has nothing to cover itself with but lies, and lies can only persist through violence. And it's not every day and not on every shoulder that violence brings down its heavy hand. It demands of us only a submission to lies, a daily participation in deceit." So what extent do you think this is kind of a kind of revolt or denial of existence itself, reality itself?
Well, thank you, Alex. I think that's precisely what's going on with Arendt, is that she's saying it is a denial of the world as it is and an attempt to make people think differently. Rather than, it is a denial of the freedom of what it is to be human. It's a denial of the ability of humans to think. She says a lot that people must think. It's very important that people think. She thinks that this world of lying, which was around her and which is with us, and I think we don't have to go anymore to other countries. It's very close to home what we're experiencing. She would suggest that thoughtfulness, thinking, is what needs to happen. And just to refer back to Eichmann in Jerusalem, that would have been one of her big problems with Eichmann. She said he didn't think. That was the big problem. He just didn't think. He obeyed orders. And we often you hear a child saying that, I just did what I was told. Well, that's okay for a child, but the adult needs to be able to think. And I suppose that brings you back then to the refuges of truth, which hopefully will form people who will be able to think, engage, question.
No, thank you. And I also thought of kind of George Orwell's 1984, which has been so topical, particularly over the last year. And again, he was so prescient, writing in the 40s. And this what you talked about Arendt in terms of changing facts, and in terms of the First World War. You see that in Orwell as well, that 2 + 2 = 5, and finally Winston come around to kind of this changing the truth. But I wonder, so is post-truth an attempt at the transformation of the human itself, and not just of the outside world? And also, to what extent, that is it also, I think so, in terms of the banality of evil, we could also talk about the anarchy of evil. And I'm thinking particularly of, is there a sense of maybe this is coming from a sense of existential boredom or existential despair, that this kind of lying or post, is it coming out of this, maybe the lack of the transcendent?
I think I wouldn't like to say that. I mean, for me as a theologian, I would see the very important role of the transcendent, of a belief in God, of a belief in that which is. But I don't think you have to go along with that type of faith to believe that a society which is based on post-truth and on lies is a dangerous society in which to live. I don't think the people who are involved in, okay, we have distinguished between the traditional lie, which is not really what we're talking about now, but it's this post-truth line that we're talking about. And I think what's going on there is actually a denial of truth itself, that it is saying that there isn't a truth. But what's the really disturbing thing is I don't believe the people who we believe are engaged in this type of thing are thinking that this is what they're doing. Mm. They have, as she has said, they have themselves deceived them very selves. So they don't see themselves. They believe the lie they are living. The whole fabric has been torn to pieces. The little hole is not there, it's the whole fabric. And just, you mentioned earlier one of the Russian writers, and there's a very good quote that I omitted from an earlier draft of the paper from Dostoevsky's brothers Karamazov. In the early stages, the father, who is a liar, asks the starets, "What must I do to gain salvation?" And the response is, "Above all, never lie to yourself." And I think that's where we're at today. I think there's a lot of lying to ourselves, which is coming into us.
And you mentioned, the university as a refuge of truth. And this reminded me of John Henry Newman's, the classic, The Idea of a University, published in the 1850s, based on a series of lectures he gave in Dublin, and this setting of the Catholic University in Dublin, which didn't really take off. And Newman was a strong advocate for the role of the university as a refuge of truth, but that they should be places of liberal or holistic educational formation, not merely professional or vocational training centres. I think that was one of the frustrations of his time in Ireland, that this kind of vocational attitude to higher education, which is still very much with us. But he was also adamant that universities have faculties of theology. So what role can theology play in the modern university? And can a return to Newman's manifesto help in kind of resuscitating the core soul of the university and its vocation as a refuge of truth in our day?
The first thing I'll have to say is that Newman's University didn't have any women, so therefore I want to move beyond that. So I think on that count, when it comes to the question of theology, Newman is interesting. In the idea of the university seems to have theology, and yet in his article on consulting the faithful in matters, the sensus fidei in matters of faith, he seems to think that theology is not for the lay people. So that's an interesting question. But your question then, which is, should theology be in the university today? Absolutely. And I'm involved in another project which is looking at the role of theology in the university, we might say in the secular university. And why should theology be in the university? Because theology, at its best, is where people are taught to think. It's theology in the tradition I work within, which is the Catholic tradition, is very much a philosophical enterprise. So it is provoking thinking, interpreting, reading. I remember when I went to Rome to do my doctorate, I was studying Thomas Aquinas, and I went to work with a particular person, but I was shocked by other people who were reading Aquinas, because they told me they read Aquinas because he has the answers. Whereas for me, reading Aquinas was and still remains, he gives you better questions. And that's the way he works. He works with questions. He reads other people. He thinks, he puts them all together. He ciphers, he sieves out information, and then he moves forward and produces another question. because that is education at its best. It's moving from a good question to a better question. And I think theology is an important role to play there. Of course, I mean, we see that theology is being very much sidelined. The humanities are being sidelined to a large extent, but theology in a particular way. And I think that is a danger for us moving forward. It's another form of altering our way of being human. I think the sciences are very important, of course, but the humanities need also to be safeguarded for the thinking, the thoughtfulness that Hannah spoke of.
Yeah. No, thank you. We're just getting some questions coming in from the wider audience. I might just open up a few questions here. This is from Emma Rothwell. If truth is coercive, is it then possible to speak of coercion as being morally good in some cases?
Very good question, Emma. Thank you. It is if within the person who commits to follow the truth, there is sort of an impelling force within you to follow the truth. I think it's very radical the way that Hannah says that truth is coercive, because we normally look on anything that is coercive as a negative, or people will say it's a sort of brainwashing. But I think there is a need for the coercive power of truth, but that involves the education of both intellect and desire. So we have to desire to want to follow the truth, to live the truth. And I think truth, it calls for such other virtues as courage, that the coercive power within it has to be very strong, because it is not necessarily the easiest thing to do, to follow the truth way, to speak for the truth in a situation where the vast majority of other people will not stand up for it. And I think Hannah's words she's a very challenging thinker, and she sort of turns things upside down all the time, very committed to the political way of being human, but can see very clearly within it the dangers of people who can be subsumed by other truths, whose opinions can be formed by other truths, and therefore the need for a truth. And she says the reason that people may not like the truth is because it is coercive. So it can be a positive thing. It's both if you like, it's both the carrot and the stick. Put it that way.
I just have two questions that I'll put together from Susanna Doyle and Cora Quinn. So is post-truth an attempt? It's Cora Quinn. And Anna O'Loughlin, apologies. So from Cora, regarding politics in the 21st century, in a world today where in some instances fact are not valued, i.e. untruths are circulated by our politicians, do we, society, always want to hear the truth? And from Anna, do all governments rest on opinion? Is post-truth gone with Trump? So is this Trump's gone? Is it? Yeah.
Sorry, the first question was, do we want to hear the truth? And I think that's a problem. We don't necessarily want to hear the truth because the truth can be uncomfortable. And I want to go back to Hannah again, the university, where do you learn the virtues, as I would use it, so that you can hear the truth? How do your ears become opened? The truth can be very, very uncomfortable. And we have to learn how to measure the truth, because sometimes speaking the truth, as we've seen with Bonhoeffer, or what we might think is speaking the truth, speaking the fact, is not necessarily the truthful way of being. So the complexity is there. But I think it's all too easy to throw it back at the politicians. But very often politicians will say what we want to hear and we will vote for them. So there's a cyclical relationship, which is destructive, which is, to use the word, violent. Like, violence doesn't have to be physical. So there is a violence in our use of words. And within our tradition, I would speak of maybe the sacrament of words, the sacrament of language. Then the second question was to do with opinion forming of post-truth. Is it gone? I don't think it is. There's another slide that I had at the very end that I didn't use, which is a picture of Pinocchio with his nose out and people going by saying he's been unemployed since Trump is gone. But I don't think that. Post-truth didn't come into existence with Trump, and post-truth won't go out of existence just because Trump is gone. If we go back to the earlier Blair and who was it bombing the weapons of mass destruction, which didn't exist. And as we prodded, we discovered that, well, they knew they weren't there really, it seems. So I think post-truth is a problem of the era we're living in. It is a problem of the mass media, the way things which were just known to a few can now be transmitted to many, and opinions are being formed. We see it in the vaccination in other countries, not in this country so much, thankfully, but people who are saying that, no, I'm not going to get vaccinated. It's all a ploy. There's no virus. Let's go out and do whatever we want. But it goes back also to the notion of an education into responsibility. Hannah says what is needed is love of the world. She speaks of amor mundi, and she calls on people. What we need to do is educate people into a love of the world so that they will take responsibility for the world. And that is needed to counter the post-truth era. To say it's gone with Trump is dangerous, because that's the world we're living in.
And this feeds into a question from Mary Rafferty. So we can talk about, how do you teach truth-telling, and how can parents and schools help children to understand the concept of truth in an environment where this concept has lost all meaning?
Yeah. In a sense, I think the children have it first off, and the problem is we knock it out of them in the world that we're in, the society. Not to skip the question, but there's a book that I have yet to read in completion by an academic in Harvard, Mark Jordan, who has written on the Summa, which is Thomas Aquinas' work, as a work of formation. So the formation of a person, the education of a person, which I would link very closely, are things which happen through this notion of education from the beginning. It happens at home and it happens in the school. I think a lot of it is about informing, about giving knowledge, about teaching. Like, I'm a little bit wary of the notion of knocking off statues. I think rather to teach the truth about what was done in the past, about the colonial era, about the good and the bad that was done, because it reminds me a little bit of what they say in Nazi Germany, that if we forget the past, it might happen again. So we need to be educated. And recently we spoke in Ireland, we had a lot of controversy about eliminating history from our programs. And I think our history needs to be taught. We need to learn from what we might call the ancients. We need to learn from the older. So it is to empower children, to give them confidence, to give them different values as well, that the value of success is not the only value in living in the world. Because if your desire is for material success, or how we measure success, even success in exams, we lose the ground on which we stand, as Hannah would say. And to give children confidence as well. But it's a lifelong journey. And I do think that truth-telling is a virtue of the mature. While we begin with a notion of truth, right and wrong, truth, we have to grow into this notion of becoming a truth-telling person, Alex. It's a very good question.
Thank you, Fáinche, and thank you for all of you who have submitted questions to the Q&A. We're just nearing the end of our time today, and so I'm just going to hand back to Amy, and thank you very much for your participation.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. That was fantastic. So interesting. And you've really given us all a lot to think about there, for sure. I'd just like to say a sincere thank you again to Fáinche and to Alexander for very generously giving us their time today on behalf of all the alumni to go through this fascinating topic with us. So thank you very much. I'd also just like to thank my colleague Alexander Owens, who's been our technical host in the background today and helped put this webinar together. I'd like to thank the audience for all those great questions, and apologies if we didn't get to them all. I've included some links there at the bottom of the screen about the Loyola Institute and an article Fáinche wrote, and we'll also include those in a follow-up email to this webinar. And just to let you know that the next webinar in the series will take place in 2 weeks' time on June 2nd, and that will be on young people, risk, resilience and mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic, with guest speakers, Professor Michael Gill, he's a professor of psychiatry and the head of the School of Medicine at Trinity, Professor Louise Gallagher, chair of child and adolescent psychiatry at Trinity, and Professor Brendan Kelly, professor at Trinity, author and consultant psychiatrist. So that is sure to be a very engaging conversation on a very topical issue. So don't miss that one. And also just to let you know that the next episode in our Future Cities series will focus on San Francisco, and that is on June 9th. And that will be with Professor Anna Davies, Professor of Geography, Environment and Society at Trinity College Dublin, and Dr. Jonathan Reichenthal, CEO of Human Future and author of Smart Cities for Dummies. So that's 2 great webinars coming up. So do keep an eye on your inboxes for more details of those. And thanks again for joining us, and take care.